The nice thing about this is that you've already learned it. Today we're going to cover el presente perfecto.
The, the present perfect or el presente perfecto is another compound tense that we're going to learn. Well, we've learned it, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into it. So, we've learned a couple other compound tenses, and compound tenses are just tenses or verb conjugations that are made up of two words. So we've learned those before, and one that we just covered again in the A ver si recuerdas part of the chapter, and that you've been learning since Spanish 1, is the present progressive. And the present progressive is when you have a conjugation of a star plus the present participle, and that ends in ando or yendo. And if you think back to chapter 2, we learned how to talk about something's condition where we used a star plus the past participle. Remember, so if you were looking at a painting and you wanted to say that someone was seated, you said está sentado. So you had a conjugation of a star plus the past participle, which ended in ado or ido. So we're learning about two participles, or we've learned about two participles, and it's important to keep that in mind. So just to recap about participles, we've talked about present participles since Spanish 1. Those are the ones that you use to talk about what you are currently doing, and we kind of equate them to ing words. So these ones use ando for AR verbs and yendo for ER-IR verbs. The past participles are different because they are made a little bit differently. And for AR verbs, they end in ado, and for ER-IR verbs, they end in ido.
Now you're probably thinking I'm crazy, but we need to cover the past participle again. Like I said just a few seconds ago, the past participle is made by taking a verb that ends in AR, dropping the ending, and adding ado. For ER and IR ending verbs, you drop the ER or the IR and you add ido. If you remember back to chapter 2, we talked a lot extensively about the irregulars for this tense. The irregulars for this tense, an easy way to remember them is to use this. Rev, Mac, PhD, D. Now hopefully you're starting to recall what those irregulars are. Starting from the beginning, R comes from romper, and it becomes roto. E comes from escribir, which turns into escrito. Escrito, yep. V comes from volver, which turns into vuelto. The second V comes from ver, which turns into visto. So as you can see, I've left two blank for you to write them in on your Google Docs form. The next that we're going to talk about is M, which comes from morir, becomes muerto. The A comes from abrir, which becomes abierto. The C comes from cubrir, which means to cover. It becomes, cubierto.
The P comes from poner, which becomes puesto. The H comes from hacer, which becomes hecho. The D comes from devolver and becomes devuelto. And the second D comes from decir, which becomes dicho.
Like I mentioned earlier, the present perfect, which we're learning about today, is a compound tense, meaning it's made up of multiple parts. And in this case, it has two parts. The first part is a conjugation of the word haber, a word that sounds like it starts with an A, but it actually starts with an H. So first we have a conjugation of haber, and the second part that we have is the past participle. So we learned the past participle with the verb estar to describe something's condition back in chapter 2, but now we're going to use it to talk about things that we have done.
The first part of this compound tense is the verb haber, and it's kind of a funny one because it starts with the letter H, but it certainly doesn't sound like it. So the verb haber, which is it's a tricky one for native speakers to be able to spell because all of the words in this conjugation start with the letter H, and when you say them out loud, it doesn't necessarily sound like it should. So the conjugations of haber, which we learned in Spanish too, are has, hemos, an. And for those of you overachievers that are really curious, it's habéis for the vosotros. When you think of this tense, you think of it in English as the has done or have done tense, right? So if I have a sentence in English, I have eaten all the chocolate, which would probably be true. I have eaten all the chocolate, I would say in Spanish, and the word for eaten comes from comer. So I have the word comer. I take off the ER. I add the ito. And I finish my sentence. He comido todo el chocolate. Now, let's say I just want to change the subject. It's super easy. And I want to say, like, you have eaten all the chocolate. Has comido todo el chocolate. So again, the participle does not change. Just the auxiliary verb does. So I'm just going to change the conjugation of my first verb to change the subject of the sentence. So if we have eaten all the chocolate, we just change our subject in the English one, and then you change the conjugation of haber, hemos comido todo el chocolate. Probably one of the most fun things to do in Spanish 3 has been to attach pronouns and like indirect object pronouns, reflexive pronouns, etc. to the end of a word and then add an accent and then make it an extremely long word. Well, at least that's been the most fun part for me. But in this case, we cannot attach anything. So if we want to make something negative, obviously you're just going to add a no to the front of it. And if you want to add a reflexive pronoun or an indirect object pronoun, you put these before haber. So all these things are going to go before. So
So you never put a conjugation of a bear and then may and then your past participle. You'd always put your reflexive pronoun, you'd always put your indirect object pronoun or your direct object pronoun or the no before a bear.